came to the mountains to forget to trade memories for solitude, lost for peace. But peace had its own voice. It spoke through the wind, the scars of an old dog, and the soil that still remembered a woman's name. What began as a retreat became a haunting return to love's unfinished work. If you felt the pull of this story, hit like, subscribe, and share what part moved you most. Ethan Cole had driven for 6 straight hours through the winding roads of Colorado, the mountains rising like stone sentinels on either side. His hands, dark and scarred from 20 years as a police sergeant in Denver, gripped the steering wheel tightly. The world beyond the windshield was a blur of white and shadow snow, swirling in soft chaos. In the passenger seat, his daughter Maya sat silently, her cocoa-colored skin glowing faintly in the dim dashboard light. She was only 9, but her eyes carried a gravity far beyond her years, a quiet born from loss. Ethan had lost his wife Sarah a year ago on a rain-slick highway when her car spun into the median. He had been the one to arrive first, at the scene badge still on his chest, heartbreaking beneath it. Since then, his home had become a grave of memories. Every hallway echoed her laughter. Every drawer held a ghost. So he left it all behind, sold the house, the furniture, the life, and bought a forgotten log cabin for $5. The listing had read rural property, abandoned, sold as is. He didn't care. He needed distance from everything that reminded him of what he could never fix. The drive grew narrower, the road twisting through trees heavy with frost. "You doing okay, baby girl?" he asked softly. Maya didn't look up from the stuffed rabbit in her lap. "Yes, sir." The way she said it hurt him more than silence. She had stopped calling him Dad the day Sarah was buried. The snow fell harder, blurring the sky into a white veil, until finally the cabin appeared, a crooked silhouette under a crown of pine. The porch sagged, the roof bowed, but to Ethan it looked like a second chance wrapped in winter's arms. He parked the truck and stepped out into the biting air, his breath ghosting in front of him. Maya followed small footprints trailing behind his larger ones. "It's smaller than the picture," she murmured. Ethan smiled faintly. Pictures lie sometimes. He tested the steps. They groaned but held. The key was cold in his hand as he slid it into the rusty lock. It turned reluctantly, as if the cabin were reluctant to be disturbed. When the door opened, the smell of dust wood and something faintly sweet, like forgotten apples, filled his lungs. The air inside was cold, thick with years of disuse. "Stay close," he said, sweeping his flashlight around. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, a sagging couch leaned against one wall, an old stove sat cold and silent in the corner. Maya's breath puffed visibly in the air. "It's freezing," she whispered. "We'll fix that." He knelt by the stove, stacking wood, striking a match. The flame caught, slowly painting the walls in amber light. As the warmth spread, something above the doorframe caught his attention. Letters carved into the wood, faint but unmistakable. "Come home, Sarah." His chest tightened. He brushed a thumb over the letters, tracing them like a wound. Daddy Maya stood beside him, her small face tilted upward. "That's Mommy's name, yeah," he said quietly. "Must have been here before." But he didn't believe it. The carving was fresh enough to catch dust differently than the rest of the wall. Outside, the pale gray of dawn seeped through the frost-coated window. He stepped to the porch, exhaling white clouds into the frozen air. The world was still, except for the faint echo of something under the floorboards, a slow, scratching rhythm that didn't match the creak of old wood. His instincts stirred those same instincts that had kept him alive in alleys and raids years ago. He crouched near the boards, listening. There it was again, claws dragging deliberate. He pressed his hand against the floor, feeling a faint vibration beneath. He didn't want to wake Maya, so he forced himself to stand. Convincing his mind it was just an animal trapped by the storm, but when Maya's voice broke the silence behind him, small and fragile, it froze him. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing at the floor. "Something's moving." Ethan turned, heart tightening at the sight of her wide eyes. "Probably a raccoon baby," he said softly, though his voice lacked conviction. She shook her head, clutching her rabbit tighter. "It sounds like it's crying." He hesitated, then retrieved his flashlight from the mantel and knelt. The boards were warped and soft with age. Using the old fireplace poker, he pried one loose dust rising in lazy spirals. Cold air rushed up through the gap, carrying a smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. When the light touched the hollow below, he saw movement, a dark shape shifting weakly. "Jesus," he murmured. At first he thought it was a coyote, but then he saw the collar glinting beneath matted fur. A large German shepherd ribs showing through her coat eyes, half open and glazed with exhaustion. She was trembling, one leg bent unnaturally, and next to her 3 tiny shapes wriggling blindly against her stomach. Pups. Ethan felt the breath leave him. "Easy, girl," he said, his voice instinctively low and steady. The dog lifted her head weakly and let out a soft growl, protective but faint. Her teeth flashed once before she sank back, chest rising in shallow jerks. Maya crouched beside him, her breath fogging the air. "She's hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "Daddy, we have to help her." Ethan hesitated. The creature's strength was nearly gone, but the fight in her eyes was still there. The same kind of defiance he'd seen in cornered men who refused to give up. "Stay back," he warned gently. "She's scared." "So am I," Maya whispered. "But Mom said being scared doesn't mean we stop caring." The words hit him harder than the cold ever could. He slid his arms under the animal slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The shepherd whimpered, but didn't resist. She was heavier than she looked, muscles knotted under thin fur, body hot with fever. The pups squeaked helplessly as he lifted them next, placing them into Maya's small cupped hands. "Hold them close," he said. "Keep them warm." They moved to the fire, Ethan lowering the dog onto a folded blanket. Her breathing was ragged, sides heaving with effort. He searched for injuries, an old scar across her ear, deep scratches along her flank, one leg swollen badly. The collar was rusted, but when he brushed away the grime, he saw the faint engraving, K9107. His chest tightened. "She's police," he muttered half to himself. A working dog, trained, abandoned, forgotten. The kind of partner that didn't leave your side unless she had to. He wondered who she'd been and why she was here beneath his cabin, as if she had crawled there to die. "What's her name?" Maya asked, cradling the smallest pup against her coat. Ethan started to answer, then stopped. He didn't know, but Maya, staring into the dog's amber eyes, whispered Faith. The sound of it hung in the room like a prayer. The shepherd blinked once, then shifted, pressing her muzzle weakly against Maya's palm. Ethan swallowed hard. He hadn't heard his daughter speak in weeks, and now her voice, steady, certain, broke the silence like sunlight through storm clouds. "Faith it is," he said quietly. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with warm water and old cloths, tearing strips from a shirt to bandage the swollen leg. His hands moved automatically, the training of years returning. He had treated bleeding men in alleys, bruised women after raids, but this was different. This felt like grace stitched into muscle and fur. Hours passed. Maya fed the pups drops of milk from a bottle they'd found in an old cupboard. Faith slept fitfully, flinching as though trapped in nightmares. When she stirred, Ethan saw the small tattooed numbers in her ear, confirming she had once been part of a unit loyal, discipline now discarded like a weapon after war. As dusk fell, the cabin filled with the soft sounds of breathing Faith, the pups, and Maya humming quietly, her tone shaky but warm. For the first time since Sarah's death, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like presence. When Ethan stepped outside that night, the sky was bruised with fading light. The trees loomed tall, the forest, whispering secrets in the wind. He looked back at the cabin, golden light flickering through the cracks, and for the first time, he didn't see a graveyard of memories. He saw life fragile, trembling but real. He sat on the porch staring at the snow, trying to piece together how this broken creature had ended up here. Maybe she had been left behind by someone running from their own ghosts. Maybe she had been drawn by the same instinct that had driven him here, the desperate need to find something pure in a world that no longer made sense. When he returned inside, Maya was asleep beside Faith, her small hand resting on the dog's neck. The pups were curled against her coat, their bellies rising and falling in unison. Faith opened her eyes, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was no fear in her anymore, only a quiet understanding. He knelt beside her, brushing a hand gently over her head. "You picked the right house," he murmured. Her tail twitched once a faint thump against the floor, and Ethan felt something inside him shift a knot, loosening a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the day of the accident. He sat beside the fire until late, watching the embers glow. When his eyelids grew heavy, he looked once more at his daughter and whispered, "Thank you, Faith." There was Rusty, the boldest, who tried to climb her lap, Willow, the smallest, always trembling, and Scout, who followed Faith's every move. The shepherd's wounds had begun to scab over, though she limped heavily on her right leg. Ethan had done what he could with the limited supplies they had, but infection was always a threat. He checked her temperature every day using the back of his weathered hand. Each time she let him, her amber eyes met his with something deeper than trust, something like memory. Ethan couldn't explain it, but he felt as though this dog knew him, or at least the kind of man he had been before grief made him a ghost. He caught himself talking to her sometimes while working outside, muttering about the repairs he needed to make the snow that wouldn't quit, or the way Maya's laughter sounded like sunlight again. Faith listened with quiet patience, her head tilted slightly, as if she understood. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, began to breathe. It wasn't loud, but there was movement, warmth, the faint sound of life returning. One afternoon, while cleaning near the hearth, Ethan found something buried deep in the straw where Faith had first been discovered. It was a torn piece of leather, stiff with age, a glove fragment. He turned it over in his hand, frowning. The faded stamp on the edge stopped him. Cold Denver Police Department. He recognized it instantly. It was the same issue he had worn for years. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, staring at the glove. It didn't make sense. Had another officer been here before him? And if so, why had they left a trained K-9 behind? He slipped the glove into his coat pocket, saying nothing to Maya. The last thing she needed was another ghost to carry. That night, he sat by the fire, the glove lying beside his chair. Faith lay near the stove, the pups nestled at her belly, and Maya sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching quietly with the stub of a pencil. Ethan studied her face in the firelight. Her hair framed her brown cheeks like a halo, her concentration absolute. The drawing she was working on showed Faith with the pups, the outlines soft but sure. "That's good," he said softly. "Looks real." Maya shrugged her eyes, flicking toward him. "Mom taught me how to draw shadows. She said they make light mean something." His chest tightened, and he forced a smile. She was right. Outside, the storm returned wind, howling like a chorus of ghosts. But inside, the cabin glowed with orange warmth, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't dread nightfall. Sleep came easier, though dreams still carried the weight of Sarah's absence. He often woke before dawn, heart pounding, unsure if the sound that woke him was real or imagined. One morning before sunrise, he stirred to the faint scrape of claws against wood. At first, he thought Faith was restless, but when he opened his eyes, he saw her by the front door, her tail low, her body steady despite the limp. Between her teeth, she held his boots, the same pair Sarah used to bring him every morning before work. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The light from the dying fire caught the edge of the boot polish, making it gleam faintly. Faith set them down, then looked up at him expectantly, her tail wagging once. Ethan's throat closed. "You miss her too, don't you?" he whispered. She stepped closer, pressing her head against his knee. He sank down beside her, burying a hand in her fur, feeling warmth radiate beneath his palm. It wasn't grief anymore. It was connection, silent and undeniable. When Maya woke later, she found her father sitting by the stove with Faith's head resting in his lap, both of them staring into the fire like old friends. "She brought you your boots," Maya said, smiling sleepily. "She wants you to go outside." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound surprising even him. Maybe she does. They spent the morning clearing snow from the porch, Faith hobbling beside them, watching each movement carefully. When Maya laughed, the dog barked once, startling the birds in the trees. It was the kind of sound that pulled the ache out of Ethan's chest. He caught himself looking at his daughter differently now, less as someone fragile and more as someone surviving beside him. In the afternoons, Maya read aloud from an old children's book they'd found in a drawer, her voice halting but clear. Sometimes she'd pause to ask questions about Sarah, what she was like, what songs she used to sing, how she smelled when she hugged him goodnight. Ethan answered each one with care, speaking slowly, painting memories not to wound but to remind. "Your mom was brave," he said once. "She didn't run from storms. She walked through them." Maya nodded thoughtfully, then looked at Faith, like her. The comparison silenced him. He stared at the dog, at the faded scars that told stories without words. Maybe his daughter was right. Maybe God had sent this creature not as a coincidence, but as a mirror, to show them how to keep moving even when the past was broken. That evening, when the fire crackled low, Maya brought her drawing to him. She had added Sarah's face faintly behind Faith's figure, like a ghost smiling from the background. "Do you like it?" she asked. Ethan's voice broke before he could answer. "It's perfect." After she went to bed, he took out the torn glove again, turning it over in his calloused hands. The question gnawed at him. If Faith had once been a police K-9, why was she here? Why under this cabin buried in straw and scars? He looked at her sleeping form, her breathing slow and steady, and knew there was more to her story. Maybe more to his, too. Beneath the wind came another sound, distant but distinct, the slow crunch of heavy boots over snow. He froze, instinct snapping awake. He had heard that rhythm too many times in back alleys and crime scenes, the deliberate tread of someone who knew how to move unseen, but wanted to be heard. Maya stirred on the couch, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, voice small and uncertain. "It's just the wind, baby," he said automatically, though his hand had already reached for the rusted poker by the hearth. Faith stood now, limping slightly, but steady, her gaze fixed on the door. The hairs along her neck bristled, and her tail hung stiff behind her. Ethan crossed the room quietly and glanced through the small front window. Snow blew sideways, blurring everything beyond the porch, but then movement. A shape emerged from the white, a tall figure trudging toward the steps, wrapped in a thick coat, with the hood pulled low. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they were walking directly toward the door. He took a breath, set Maya's drawing off the table, and whispered, "Stay with Faith." She nodded silently, clutching the rabbit to her chest. The knock came sharp and sudden, a hollow thud that seemed too calm for a night like this. Ethan waited, heart hammering. Another knock, harder this time. He moved to the door, his voice steady but firm. "Who's there?" No answer, just the rasp of wind squeezing through the cracks. He unlocked the latch and opened the door halfway, keeping the poker low at his side. The man standing there looked like he'd been carved out of the storm itself, tall, lean coat torn and patched, his skin weathered by years of cold and labor. His eyes were pale gray, and his face bore the deep lines of a life lived hard. He stared at Ethan with a strange familiarity, like someone studying a name they already knew. "You're a long way from Denver." "Sergeant Cole," he said, his voice rough, almost amused. Ethan's stomach clenched. "How do you know my name? It's my business to know who steps on cursed ground." The man's lips curled into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't be here. This cabin's not clean." For a moment, Ethan forgot the cold, biting at his face. "What are you talking about, the woman before you?" the stranger said, tilting his head toward the roof. "She tried to fix this place too. She left something behind when she couldn't." Ethan stepped forward, poker tightening in his grip. "You need to leave." The man's smile faded. "You think you found peace here, officer, but this land remembers what it took. It always does." His hand brushed the handle of the knife strapped to his belt, but he didn't draw it. "Walk away while you can," Faith growled behind Ethan, deep and guttural, her body a wall between Maya and the door. Ethan stood his ground voice low. "You need to go now." For a long second, neither moved. Then the man chuckled a dry sound, swallowed by the wind. "Suit yourself." He stepped back into the snow, his boots crunching slowly, deliberately. Before vanishing into the white, he looked over his shoulder and said, "The woman before you left something behind." Then he was gone, the storm closing around him as though he had never existed. Ethan shut the door hard, bolting it twice. He turned to see Maya trembling beside Faith. "Who was that?" she whispered. "No one we need to worry about." He lied, but his mind was already racing. He had never given anyone in town his name, never mentioned his old badge, and yet the stranger had spoken it easily. He went to the window, staring out into the blur of snow, but the man had disappeared entirely. No footprints led away from the porch. Only untouched drifts stretched into the trees. The fire cracked behind him, and he realized his hands were shaking. He poured a small cup of water, forcing himself to breathe. "He's gone," he murmured. "We're safe." But Faith didn't relax. She stayed by the door, muscles taut, ears flicking at every creak. Ethan sat on the couch, running his hand through his short-cropped hair. He had seen madness before, had spoken to people broken by grief, isolation, and war, and yet there had been something too clear, too certain in that man's eyes. The words lingered. "The woman before you left something behind." Later, when Maya had fallen asleep again, Ethan sat in the dim light, the poker still within reach. He could hear the wind against the walls, the soft whimper of the pups, and the faint scratch of Faith's claws on the floor. Every sound magnified the silence between them. He wanted to believe the man had been a drifter, someone passing through. But the way he said Sergeant Cole, that was deliberate. It meant he'd been watched, maybe even followed. Ethan's mind drifted back to the glove he had found days earlier, the one marked Denver Police Department. What if it hadn't belonged to Faith's handler at all? What if it belonged to someone who'd come here after Sarah's accident? The thought twisted something in his chest. He took the glove from the shelf and turned it over in his hands. The stitching was frayed, but faint traces of blood marked the inner lining, human, not animal. He wrapped it in a rag and placed it inside a drawer. No need to tell Maya yet. She had begun to smile again. He wouldn't take that away. He stoked the fire until it roared, light spilling across the room. Faith settled reluctantly near the hearth, but kept her gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the storm's voice rose and fell, but beneath it, Ethan thought he heard something else. A whistle, low and tuneless, like someone calling to a dog. He went cold. Faith's ears twitched, and she lifted her head. The sound came again, faint but certain. Ethan grabbed the lantern, stepping to the window, his breath fogging the glass. Only snow and shadows. Still, the whistle lingered like an echo between heartbeats. When he turned back, Maya was standing near the doorway, her small voice trembling. "Daddy," she whispered. I think he was talking about Mom. Ethan's hand froze on the lantern. "What do you mean?" he said. "The woman before us left something." Mom's scarf was under the floor. What if she was here too? Her words hit him like a hammer. He crouched to meet her eyes, steadying his tone. "Sweetheart, Mom never came here. That scarf just somehow found its way." But even as he said it, the lie felt hollow. The timing, the carving above the door, the police glove, the stranger's words, it all wove together too neatly to be chance. He held her tight until her small body stopped trembling. When she finally slept, he sat alone by the fire again. the poker in one hand, the weight of everything pressing down. At some point, exhaustion took him. He woke hours later to silence so deep it felt heavy. The storm had passed. Moonlight spilled across the cabin floor, silvering everything it touched. Faith stood at the window, tail-stiff ears forward. Ethan rose slowly, his heart still pounding from dreams he couldn't remember. Outside, the world lay untouched, serene. The storm had left the world quiet again. The kind of stillness that felt deliberate, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The snow outside lay unbroken, except for the faint prints that vanished near the trees. Ethan Cole didn't tell Maya what he'd seen that morning. He didn't tell her how the stranger's footprints had disappeared halfway across the yard, how Faith had stood there stiff and silent, her breath clouding the air in short bursts. He didn't tell her that when the wind picked up again, he swore he heard the faint whistle one last time, carried through the pines like a memory that refused to fade. Instead, he focused on small things, splitting wood, patching the roof, boiling water for the dogs. But the silence of the forest pressed in on him with each passing day. Faith's behavior changed too. She stayed near the door, watching the snow with eyes sharp and knowing. At night, she'd whine softly, her gaze fixed towards the woods, as if expecting someone to return. Ethan's mind kept circling back to what the man had said. The woman before you left something behind. He wanted to forget, but grief had a way of clawing its way back, no matter how deep you buried it. On the fourth day after the storm, the firewood pile was running low. He spent the afternoon in the shed behind the cabin, the air thick with sawdust and the metallic scent of old tools. The quiet was heavy, interrupted only by the rhythmic crack of his axe. When he returned inside, Maya was crouched by the floor near Faith's old nesting spot, her breath fogging in the chill. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" he asked. She looked up, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly. "There's something here," she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her, the floor creaking under his weight. Faith had used the space beneath the boards as her refuge when they first found her, and now it was filled with old straw bits of cloth and bones from small animals she must have scavenged. Maya reached deeper, brushing aside the debris. Her fingers caught something soft. She pulled it free, coughing as dust rose in a faint golden cloud. In her hands lay a red scarf, frayed and dirty, the color dulled but still unmistakable. Ethan felt his chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. "Where did you get that?" he asked, though he already knew. "It was stuck under the straw," Maya said. Voice trembling, she smoothed the fabric with her small fingers. The pattern stitched along the edges was clumsy, uneven, but familiar. Sarah had embroidered that scarf by hand during one long winter, sitting by the window, laughing at her own crooked stitches. Ethan reached out and touched it, his fingers tracing the threads, like a man reading a prayer in Braille. The fabric was cold but carried a faint scent of smoke and something sweet lavender oil, Sarah's favorite. His throat closed around her name. "This can't be," he murmured. "It's been a year." Faith limped closer, sniffing the scarf. When Ethan turned it over, he saw small threads of fur clinging to it, black and tan, the same colors as Faith's coat. His heart stopped. It wasn't possible. Sarah had died miles away on a rain-soaked road near Denver. Faith had been found buried beneath this cabin months later. There was no way the two had ever met, and yet the proof sat in his hands, undeniable. Maya's eyes glistened. "Mom sent her to find us," she whispered. Ethan looked at his daughter, her trembling voice breaking something inside him that had been frozen too long. "Maybe she did," he said, his words barely audible. He wrapped the scarf around her small shoulders, the fabric too large, swallowing her frame. She smiled faintly and pressed her face into it, breathing in the scent. "It smells like home," she said, and for the first time since Sarah's death, she looked at peace. That night, Ethan sat alone at the table, the scarf folded neatly before him, the fire's glow painting it gold. Faith lay near the hearth, eyes half open. her ears twitching at every crackle. The pups had grown bold, tumbling across the floor in noisy bursts of energy that Maya greeted with laughter. Ethan watched her from across the room, her face bright in the firelight, and felt the ache of something he hadn't dared feel in months: gratitude. But beneath that warmth, questions gnawed at him. If Faith had belonged to Sarah, why hadn't he known had Sarah been connected to this cabin somehow before she died? And why had the stranger spoken of the woman before you as if he'd seen her here himself? He took the torn police glove from the drawer and placed it beside the scarf. Together they looked like fragments of a story, half remembered. When he leaned close, he noticed faint blood on the scarf's hem. Not fresh, but old brown, long dried. He sat back the air, leaving his lungs. "What happened here?" he whispered. Faith stirred, lifting her head, her eyes glowing in the firelight. For a second he thought he saw recognition flicker in them, as if she too remembered something painful. He reached out, resting a hand on her scarred head. "You were with her, weren't you?" he said softly. The dog blinked, then pressed her muzzle into his palm. The connection hit him like a current: grief, loyalty, love, all tangled in the space between them. Later that night, while Maya slept curled near the pups, Ethan stood by the window. The storm clouds had cleared, and the moon hung low, bathing the world in silver. The forest looked peaceful, but he no longer trusted the quiet. He held the scarf, his thumb brushing the uneven stitching, and saw Sarah's smile in his mind, the way she used to tilt her head when she teased him, the way her hair had caught the light. The ache in his chest was sharp, but beneath it came something gentler, a realization that maybe love didn't die with the body. Maybe it found new ways to return in paw prints, in whispers, in the fragile thread of a scarf buried under dust. He turned to the fire, speaking to the room, though no one could hear him. "You found us, didn't you, Sarah? You found a way." The cabin answered only with the soft crackle of wood, but the warmth felt different, deeper, as if someone unseen had breathed it into life. He folded the scarf again, placing it beside the photograph of Sarah he kept tucked in his wallet. Tomorrow he would drive to town for supplies, maybe ask about the cabin's history, about who had lived here before it was sold for $5. But tonight, he let the fire burn low, the scarf resting near the hearth where Faith slept. The morning after the discovery of the red scarf began with sunlight that felt almost merciful. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world carved in silver and gold, the air crisp, sharp, and painfully clean. Ethan stood outside with an axe in one hand, splitting logs with the slow precision of a man trying to quiet the noise in his mind. Every strike echoed through the woods, scattering birds from the trees. Inside, Maya's laughter mixed with the playful yelps of the pups, a sound that should have been comforting, but instead made Ethan ache. Each log that split beneath his hands reminded him of how fragile things could look before they broke apart completely. When he finally stopped sweat freezing against his skin, he turned toward the cabin and saw Faith sitting at the doorway, her head tilted, watching him as if measuring his thoughts. He dropped the axe and crouched beside her, his breath clouding the air between them. "You knew her, didn't you?" he whispered. "You knew Sarah." Her tail gave one slow wag, her eyes steady her scars bright against her fur. He reached out his hand, resting lightly on her head. The warmth of her body against his palm steadied him more than any prayer could. That afternoon, he decided to fix the cracks in the fireplace, not because it needed it, but because he couldn't stand still anymore. He pulled the old bricks loose, carefully sweeping the ash aside. The soot clung to his hands, black and oily, marking the creases of his skin like pennants. As he pried free a loose stone near the base, something thin fluttered out a piece of paper, half-burned edges curled and brittle. He caught it before it fell into the fire. His heart stuttered when he turned it over. It was a photograph, smoke-stained but still visible. The image showed a woman kneeling beside a German Shepherd Faith, her coat younger, her body whole and unscarred. The woman's smile was unmistakable. Sarah. She wore a reflective rescue vest with a small patch Colorado emergency response team. Ethan's breath caught, and the room seemed to tilt around him. His wife had never told him about working with rescue animals, not once. He sat down heavily on the hearth, staring at the photo until the edges began to crumble between his fingers. Faith, sensing something shift, limped closer, resting her head on his knee. "You were hers," he whispered, voice cracking. "You belonged to Sarah." The realization hit him like a wave, cold and electrifying. The way Faith had looked at him, the way she had known where to dig, the way she had flinched at the mention of Sarah's name, it all made sense now. The dog had found her way here not by chance, not by instinct alone, but because she remembered where love used to live. He thought back to the stranger's warning, to the way the man had said, "The woman before you left something behind." Sarah hadn't left an object, she'd left a living memory. Ethan pressed the photo to his chest and closed his eyes. The silence around him deepened until he could hear his own pulse. When he finally stood, he found Maya sitting on the couch with one of the pups in her lap, drawing something in her sketchbook. "Daddy, is everything okay?" she asked. He hesitated, then forced a small smile. "Yeah, baby, everything's better than I thought." That night, after putting Maya to bed, he sat outside on the porch with Faith beside him, the moonlight turning the snow into a sea of diamonds. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional crack of ice breaking loose from branches. He pulled the photo from his pocket and stared at it again, the faint image of Sarah's smile, trembling in the pale light. "You came back for her, didn't you?" he said softly. "You found us because you remembered." Faith lifted her head and looked up at him, her breath clouding the air between them. For a moment, he swore he saw recognition in her eyes, something deeper than animal instinct, something like devotion that transcended the line between memory and miracle. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. He let the cold sting his skin, grounding him to this moment, to this fragile proof that the universe hadn't forgotten them. When he went back inside, Maya was asleep on the couch, her drawing beside her. He picked it up gently. It showed their little family, him, Maya, the pups, and Faith all standing outside the cabin, and above them in soft pencil strokes, she had drawn Sarah watching over them from the clouds. The sight hit him so hard, he had to sit down. For months, he had been building walls around his grief, thinking that strength meant silence, that healing meant forgetting. But now he understood that memory wasn't the enemy. It was the bridge. He placed the drawing on the mantel beside the scarf and the worn police glove. Faith came to his side, pressing against his leg as if to steady him. "You're part of her," he whispered, "and she's part of you. Maybe that's why she trusted you to find us." Faith lay down with a heavy sigh, the pups clambering over her in sleepy play. The fire popped softly, sending sparks into the dark. Outside, a new wind began to rise, carrying with it a sound almost too faint to notice a whistle low and slow, the same note Sarah had used to call the dog home in the training fields years ago. Ethan froze. Faith lifted her head, her ears twitching, then settled back down calmly, her tail thumping once. Ethan smiled through tears he didn't bother to hide. "It's her," he said, voice barely a breath. "She's telling us we're okay now." The hours stretched toward midnight, and the world outside the cabin felt lighter somehow, the cold, gentler the air alive with unseen warmth. Before going to bed, Ethan tucked the photograph into a small wooden box, along with the scarf and glove, sealing it with quiet reverence. He set it on the mantel beneath Maya's drawing, a small shrine to love that refused to die. As he turned down the lamp, he whispered to the shadows, "Thank you, Sarah." In the stillness that followed, Faith exhaled deeply and rested her head on her paws, her breathing slow, content. Spring arrived in the high country like a shy visitor, slow and cautious, but full of promise. The last of the snow melted from the eaves, dripping into small puddles that mirrored the pale blue of the sky. The trees woke first, their branches swelling with new buds, and the smell of thawed earth filled the air with the scent of beginning. Ethan Cole leaned against the porch railing, watching Maya kneel in the mud behind the cabin with her hands buried to the wrists, planting seeds she had collected from town. The soil was dark and rich, and her laughter rose every time one of the pups tried to dig up her work. Faith stood nearby, her limp, almost gone tail wagging softly as she guarded the small garden that was slowly taking shape. The air carried warmth again, and Ethan felt something inside him match it. The photograph of Sarah and Faith still rested on the mantel framed now beside Maya's drawing. The sight of them together no longer filled him with grief, but with something quieter, a sense of continuity, of the invisible thread binding past and present. That morning, he drove into the nearby town for the first time in weeks. The main street was a stretch of modest shops, a diner, a church steeple that leaned slightly with age. He had never paid attention before, but now he saw how people here nodded at strangers, how the rhythm of life slowed enough to notice simple kindnesses. He parked in front of a small art supply store, thinking of Maya's pencils worn down to stubs. A bell chimed when he entered, and behind the counter stood a tall, thin woman in her 60s hair tied back in a silver braid, eyes bright with curiosity. "You're new," she said, her voice both gentle and direct. "Not many faces I don't recognize around here." "Ethan Cole," he said, offering a handshake. "My daughter and I bought the old cabin near the ridge." The woman's expression softened. "That place has stories," she said, reaching for a paper bag. "I'm Margaret Hill. Used to teach art at the community center before my hands started shaking." She lifted her right hand slightly, the fingers curved with arthritis. "What brings you to my shop, my little girl draws," Ethan said. "I thought maybe she could use some proper tools." Margaret smiled, pulling a small set of sketch pencils from a drawer. "That's a good thing to keep her doing. Art helps children make sense of the things adults can't explain." Ethan hesitated, then asked, "Did you ever meet someone named Sarah Cole? She volunteered here, maybe 10 years ago, with the rescue unit." Margaret's hand stilled. "Sarah Cole," she repeated softly. "Yes, I remember her. Lovely woman. Always had a German shepherd with her, Grace No Faith, that was it. She used to help train the dogs for mountain rescues. They worked just above the ridge where that cabin stands." Ethan's chest tightened. "You're sure?" "As sure as these old eyes let me be," Margaret said. "She had a kind heart, that one. Said she wanted to build a safe place for animals someday, somewhere quiet where they could heal." Ethan thanked her, paid for the pencils, and left with his mind swirling. Sarah had walked the same woods, stood under the same trees, and worked with the same dog now lying at his feet each night. She had never told him. Maybe she had planned to surprise him. Maybe she hadn't wanted to jinx a dream not yet ready to bloom. Back at the cabin, he told Maya what Margaret had said. Her eyes widened with wonder. "So Faith knew the way home," she said softly. "Mom taught her how." Ethan smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. Seems she did. Over the next few weeks, the cabin truly became a home. The garden grew in neat rows of beans and wildflowers. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, and the sound of laughter replaced the quiet of mourning. Maya spent her afternoons sketching in the sunlight, her drawings full of color and hope. One day, Margaret drove up in her old pickup, bringing supplies and a flyer for a children's art contest in town. "You should enter this," she told Maya. "There's a prize for creativity, but more than that, it's good for the heart." Maya hesitated at first, shy and uncertain, but Ethan encouraged her. She spent 3 evenings working on her entry, sitting by the window with Faith at her side, drawing until the candle burned low. When she finished, she called her father over. The drawing showed Faith lying in the garden with the pups, sunlight streaming through the trees, and behind them, faint and ghost-like, the image of Sarah smiling from the edge of the sky. Across the bottom in careful handwriting, Maya had titled it, "Faith and Her Children." Ethan's throat ached when he saw it. "It's beautiful," he said. "Mom would be proud." The contest day came warm and bright. The town hall was crowded with families, the walls lined with drawings of farms, lakes, and animals. Maya's picture hung near the center, simple, but filled with feeling. As the judges walked the room, Ethan stood beside Margaret, who whispered, "Your girl has her mother's soul." When they announced the winners, Maya's name was called for first prize. She froze, eyes wide, then turned toward Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. She climbed onto the small stage, clutching her drawing. "My mom used to say that love never gets lost," she said softly, her voice steady despite the crowd. "Sometimes it just finds another way home. Faith found us when we were sad. She brought back what we thought we'd lost." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then from the back of the hall, Faith barked once, a deep, clear sound that echoed like an answer from another world. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt his chest tighten with pride and something deeper, something sacred. Later, as they walked home under a setting sun, Maya held her ribbon in one hand and Faith's leash in the other. "Do you think Mom saw me?" she asked. Ethan looked at the sky painted in gold and rose. "I think she never stopped watching." When they reached the cabin, the garden shimmered with new life-green shoots rising from the soil. Ethan leaned against the porch rail, watching his daughter chase the pups across the yard while Faith trotted beside her, strong and sure once again. The light of dusk bathed them all, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Ethan felt no fear of what tomorrow might bring. The world no longer seemed divided between what had been lost and what remained. It was one continuous circle, love turning back into itself. The summer nights in the mountains carried a kind of peace that was both fragile and deep. The air smelled of pine and soil, the hum of insects weaving with the slow rhythm of crickets. The cabin had become a living thing, now full of warmth and laughter, its walls no longer echoing with loss. Ethan sat on the porch one evening, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, watching Maya draw by lantern light while Faith and the pups lay stretched across the wooden floor. The glow from the windows spilled onto the garden below, where green vines curled up thin stakes, the plants thriving under Maya's patient care. Life had returned to every corner of this forgotten place, but sometimes when the wind changed, Ethan still felt the past move like a quiet current beneath it all. That night when the moon rose high, he couldn't sleep. The air had grown too still, the silence too heavy. He lay on the couch, eyes open, listening to the slow creak of wood, the breathing of the dogs, the faint whisper of trees. Then came the sound, a crunch outside, deliberate and slow, like boots sinking into soft earth. Faith's head lifted instantly, ears forward, her muscles tensing under her fur. Ethan rose quietly, reaching for the lantern on the shelf. The pup stirred but didn't bark. He opened the door, the hinge groaning softly. The night was bright under the full moon silver light glinting off the leaves and the small ripples in the pond beyond the clearing. The air was cold enough to sting, and yet beneath the sharpness lay something warm, something familiar. He stepped off the porch. Each movement measured his boots sinking into damp soil. "Hello?" he called softly. His voice didn't carry far. Faith followed at his side, her steps silent but sure. The garden stretched before them, rows of beans and flowers shimmering under moonlight. And then he saw it, a shadow long and unmistakably human moving just beyond the fence. Ethan's heart clenched. "Who's there?" he said again, his tone harder now. The figure froze for a heartbeat, then vanished into the trees. Ethan hurried forward, lantern swinging. The light caught something glinting near the far corner of the garden, half buried in the soil. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a small wooden tag, worn smooth with age, a faded inscription carved into the surface: Sarah Sea Search and Rescue. His breath left him in a rush. Faith stood beside him, nose pressed to the tag tail, wagging slowly. "Sarah," he whispered the word, breaking apart in his throat. He turned the tag over and saw a faint number etched beneath 1979. It was the year the old rescue program had been founded in these mountains, a detail he'd once read in a news article Sarah had saved on her computer years ago. She had known about this place long before they bought the cabin. He sat back on his heels staring at the garden. She had chosen this land not by accident, but with purpose. It wasn't just a cabin she wanted. It was the beginning of a dream. The soil that now fed their food had once been the ground she meant to dedicate to saving lives both human and animal. Ethan looked towards the woods where the shadow had disappeared, his pulse slowing. The fear that had risen in his chest softened into awe. He no longer believed it was a stranger. He believed it was her. The moon slipped behind a cloud, dimming the clearing. Ethan rose and placed the tag on the porch rail. Inside, Maya stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, where'd you go?" she asked sleepily. He smiled faintly, stepping back into the doorway. "Just outside," he said, "checking on the garden." "Is it okay?" "It's perfect," he said softly. "Your mom would have loved it." She yawned and curled back up on the couch, Faith settling beside her. Ethan sat awake for the rest of the night, the tag warm in his hand, his mind circling the truth now laid bare. Sarah had found this cabin first. She had worked with Faith here, planned to make it their future. And somehow, through a chain of coincidences that no longer felt random, she had brought them both back to finish what she started. In the morning, the sun rose, golden and soft through the mist. Ethan stood in the garden again, the tag resting in his palm. He dug a small hole at the edge of the garden, right beside the tallest flower that Maya had planted weeks ago. He set the tag there, covering it gently with soil. "This is yours," he whispered. "We'll take care of it now." Faith sat beside him, her fur catching the light. When he stood, Maya appeared behind him, barefoot and sleepy. "What are you doing, Daddy?" He turned and smiled. "Just planting something important." She tilted her head, curious. "What was it a reminder?" he said. "That love doesn't end, it grows." That day felt different. The cabin glowed with life. Neighbors from town visited to drop off extra seeds and old tools. Margaret stopped by again with jars of paint for Maya and stayed long enough to share coffee on the porch. "You've changed this place," she said, looking around the clearing. "It used to feel haunted. Now it feels blessed." Ethan nodded, though his gaze lingered on the garden. "It's her doing," he said quietly. "She led us here." That evening, Maya showed Margaret her new painting, Faith standing in the sunlight surrounded by blooming flowers, a faint outline of Sarah's face reflected in the pond beside her. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered. "You captured something only love could see." After dinner, when the stars appeared like 1,000 candles above the pines, Ethan and Maya sat outside again. The air hummed softly, the forest alive with quiet sounds. "Daddy," Maya said suddenly, "do you think Mom's still here?" Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling. "I think she never left," he said. "She's in the way the flowers grow in Faith's bark, and how the wind sounds when it passes through the trees. She's part of all of this." Maya leaned her head against his arm, silent but smiling. Faith lay at their feet, the pups curled beside her, their breathing slow and steady. When the wind picked up, it brushed through the flowers, carrying a faint scent of lavender, the same scent that had clung to Sarah's scarf. It began with the wind, a dry electric wind that swept down the mountain, carrying the smell of iron and the low growl of thunder. By dusk, the air had changed heavy and charged the sky split by long veins of lightning that flickered like warning signs above the pines. Ethan had seen summer storms before, but this one felt different, impatient, hungry. He was stacking the last of the chopped wood against the shed when the first flash came, followed by the crack of thunder so loud it seemed to split the air in two. Faith barked sharply, tail stiff, her body tense as she faced the ridge. Inside, Ethan called, grabbing the axe and rushing toward the cabin. The smell of ozone stung his nose, and before he reached the porch, another bolt struck closer this time. The ground shook, and from somewhere deep in the forest came a sound he would never forget, the sudden whoosh of fire catching dry branches. Within minutes, orange light flickered between the trees, spreading fast. "Maya," he shouted. She appeared at the window, eyes wide, clutching one of the pups. "Daddy, the sky's red, stay by the door," he yelled, pulling her outside. Faith paced anxiously, barking toward the woods, her instincts alive with urgency. The wind carried sparks, now each one glowing like a tiny comet, before disappearing into the night. Ethan shoved open the truck door, motioning for Maya to climb in. "We have to go now." But when he turned toward the path, he saw it. The road blocked by a fallen pine, thick smoke rising from behind it. Flames had already started to crawl across the ground, devouring dry grass with frightening speed. They were trapped. Daddy Maya's voice trembled. "What do we do?" He took a breath, forcing calm into his tone. "We stay low and we move fast." He looked around, calculating. The only chance was to reach the old stream behind the cabin. It cut deep enough through the rock to offer some protection if the fire came too close. "Grab the pups," he ordered. She nodded, her small hands steady, despite the fear in her eyes. They ran together toward the back clearing, Faith leading the way, her powerful body darting between trees. Smoke thickened, stinging their throats and eyes. The fire moved like a living thing, roaring and snapping, the heat pressing against their backs. When they reached the stream, Ethan pulled Maya down behind a boulder, splashing water over their clothes. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move." Faith barked again, not toward them this time, but deeper into the woods, where frightened animals cried out, deer foxes, the wild things that had made the forest their home. Ethan saw her pause, torn between instinct and duty. "Faith," he shouted, but she was already gone, sprinting into the smoke, her silhouette vanishing among the flames. "No," Maya cried. "She'll die." Ethan held her close, his own heart tearing as he watched the fire swallow the space where Faith had run. He wanted to chase her, but the smoke was too thick, the flames too close. Hours passed like an eternity. Rain began to fall near dawn, slow at first, then steady, turning the air into a hiss of steam. The fire retreated grudgingly, leaving behind a landscape of blackened trees and glowing embers. When the danger had passed, Ethan lifted Maya and the pups from the stream bed, their bodies shaking but alive. The cabin still stood scorched but unbroken, the roof smoldering where ash had fallen. The garden, however, was gone, reduced to wet ashes and charred soil. Ethan felt the loss like a knife. It wasn't just earth that had burned. It was Sarah's dream, the piece of her he had promised to protect. Maya stood beside him, tears cutting lines through soot on her cheeks. "Where's Faith?" she whispered. The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan searched until the sun rose, fully combing the blackened woods with a lantern in one hand and hope clinging desperately to the other. For hours he found nothing but silence. Then near the ridge he heard it, a faint whimper, low and trembling. "Faith," he called, his voice breaking. He followed the sound and found her lying near the base of a fallen tree, her fur singed, one paw bleeding. She lifted her head weakly when she saw him. In her mouth, she held something small and blackened. Ethan knelt, tears spilling freely now. "Hey girl," he whispered, his hands shaking as he touched her. "You did good. You did so good." He opened her jaw gently and took what she had been holding. It was the wooden tag from the garden, Sarah Sea Search and Rescue, burned around the edges but still whole. Faith had gone back for it. She had saved the one thing that carried Sarah's name, carrying it through smoke and fire to deliver it safely to them. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "You didn't just survive," he said softly. "You came back for her." Maya knelt beside them, sobbing quietly, her small hand resting on Faith's chest. "Is she okay?" she whispered. Ethan nodded through tears. "She will be." He carried the dog back to the cabin, wrapping her in a blanket and tending to her wounds with careful hands. The pup circled her, whining softly, licking her face as if urging her to stay. Faith's breathing steadied slowly, her amber eyes dull with exhaustion, but still filled with that same fierce loyalty that had saved them time and time again. The next morning, the townspeople came with trucks and water tanks, helping to douse the remaining embers. Margaret arrived too, her eyes wide when she saw the blackened earth. "My God," she whispered, "you're lucky to be alive." Ethan nodded, too tired to speak. She helped Maya clean the pups while he repaired what he could. When she saw the charred tag resting on the table, her voice caught. "That was hers," she said softly. "She brought it back." Ethan nodded. She saved what mattered most. They buried the tag again later that afternoon, this time in the heart of the garden beneath the new soil that the townspeople helped them lay. Ethan placed his hand on the ground and whispered, "She finished your work, Sarah. She kept your name alive." When he looked up, autumn crept down from the mountains slowly that year, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of pine and smoke, the trees dressed in gold before winter claimed them again. It had been 3 months since the fire, and the forest was healing in quiet, patient ways. Green shoots pushed through blackened soil moss crept back over the fallen logs, and the stream ran clear again, carrying away ash, like memory washing clean. The cabin still bore its scars, dark streaks up the porch rail, scorch marks on the doorframe, but inside it felt whole. Ethan stood in the doorway one morning, coffee steaming in his hand, watching Maya run barefoot through the field with the pups tumbling after her. Faith lay nearby on the porch, her fur grown back in patches, her body slower now, but her eyes bright with contentment. She had survived against all odds, and though her limp remained, she carried it with quiet dignity, like an old soldier who'd made peace with her battle. Ethan smiled, the lines around his eyes softer now, his heart no longer weighed down by the what-ifs. The cabin had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It had stripped him bare, then built him back piece by piece, teaching him that grief wasn't something to outrun, but something to live with, to honor, to turn into something that grows. After the fire, the townspeople had returned often to help rebuild. Margaret Hill came with her students to repaint the walls. Neighbors brought seedlings and soil, filling the garden again. But something strange had happened in the weeks after they'd planted nothing near the spot where Sarah's wooden tag was buried. Yet one morning, Maya woke Ethan, her voice trembling with excitement. "Daddy, come look," she cried, dragging him by the hand toward the garden. The ground was misty from dawn, the soil dark and damp, and right in the center of the clearing, where the ashes had been thickest, a patch of wildflowers had bloomed overnight, dozens of them, delicate and blue, their petals glistening like tears under sunlight. Ethan knelt, brushing his fingers over them. They were forget-me-nots, Sarah's favorite. He remembered how she used to weave them into her hair during summer hikes, laughing when he called her a mountain fairy. His throat tightened as Maya knelt beside him. "Did we plant them?" she asked softly. "No," he whispered. "They found their way on their own." She looked up at him, her face serious. "Does that mean Mom's still here?" Ethan took a deep breath, the cool air filling his chest, then placed his hand over hers. "She never left, sweetheart. Some roots go deeper than death." Maya smiled, then small and radiant, the kind of smile that could break open the hardest winter. She reached down and picked one of the flowers, tucking it gently behind Faith's ear. "Now she's part of all of us," she said. Faith wagged her tail, leaning into her touch, and for a moment the world stood perfectly still, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. In the weeks that followed, the wildflowers spread. They climbed the fence posts, grew along the porch steps, and spilled across the garden until it looked as though the cabin had been wrapped in a blue sea of petals. People from town began to visit just to see them. Margaret called it the Garden of Grace. Ethan preferred to think of it as Sarah's last gift, a reminder that beauty could rise from ruin, that love, when planted deep enough, never truly dies. One evening in late October, as the first frost glittered on the grass, Ethan and Maya sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. The sky burned gold and crimson, the light catching on Faith's fur as she rested beside them. The pups were nearly grown now, strong and healthy. Their playful energy, a constant reminder of life continuing no matter what the world takes away. Maya leaned her head against his arm. "Daddy, do you think Mom can see all this?" she asked. Ethan looked out at the field where the flowers swayed in the cool wind, where the air shimmered with that quiet magic that only comes when the heart recognizes something eternal. "I think she's the reason it's here," he said softly. "Every bloom, every leaf, every laugh we've had since. She planted it all." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one. The night settled gently over them, the fire crackling behind the cabin, the world humming with peace. For the first time since that terrible day on the highway, Ethan didn't feel haunted by what he'd lost. He felt surrounded by what had endured: Sarah's laughter in Maya's voice, her compassion in Faith's eyes, her dream in the garden's endless bloom. He realized that grief had never been about forgetting. It had always been about remembering with love. Later that night, after putting Maya to bed, Ethan stepped outside again. The moon hung low, silvering the garden. Faith limped to his side, sitting quietly. He crouched down, resting a hand on her neck. "You brought us through everything," he murmured. "You carried her memory when I couldn't." Faith pressed her head against his shoulder, her breath warm against his skin. The air was cool, crisp, alive. Somewhere in the woods, an owl hooted softly, and the stream whispered its steady song. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the stars. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered. "You gave us home again." When the wind moved through the garden, the flowers bent all at once, swaying in unison, as if bowing to the same unseen presence. Faith lifted her head, ears twitching, then wagged her tail once before settling again. Ethan stayed there until the moon reached its highest point, letting the quiet fill him. The pain that had once lived inside him was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer sharp, no longer hollow. It was something softer now, something that felt like belonging. Months later, when winter returned and snow covered the valley again, the wildflowers vanished beneath the frost. But Ethan knew they would come back. Some things always do. On the first morning of spring, he stood in the same spot, coffee in hand, as sunlight touched the soil. And there, pushing through the melting snow, was the first blue petal of the year. He smiled, whispering to the air, "Welcome home." Inside, Maya's laughter echoed as the pups barked, and Faith's deep, steady breath filled the cabin with the rhythm of peace. The cabin that had once been bought for $5 now held something beyond price. A legacy of love that survived storms, fire, and time. The end. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and which moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Faith carried Sarah's tag from the fire, or when the wildflowers bloomed over the ashes? I'd love to know how you felt about their journey.